On a Thursday morning in May 2026, a single headline out of Washington sent tremors through Beijing's quantum labs. And it wasn't a new breakthrough, a stolen secret, or a scientific leap. It was $2 billion. And within hours, it had rewritten the rules of a race that China thought it was already winning. For years, the narrative had been simple, almost comfortable. China was pouring state money into quantum technology at a scale the United States couldn't match. Beijing had satellites in orbit, a sprawling quantum communication backbone stretching between its major cities, and a government machine capable of moving billions of dollars into a single strategic priority overnight. America, by contrast, looked fragmented. Universities here, startups there, a patchwork of federal agencies, each running their own slice of the puzzle, and a private sector that moved on venture capital timelines rather than 5-year plans. If you had asked most analysts a year earlier who was winning the quantum race, the answer would have leaned uneasily toward China. Then came that Thursday morning. Word broke, first through a Wall Street Journal report and then confirmed across major outlets, that the United States Commerce Department was preparing something unprecedented. A $2 billion funding package aimed squarely at 9 quantum computing companies, with the federal government taking equity stakes in each one. This wasn't a research grant buried in an appropriations bill. This was the United States government deciding, explicitly and publicly, to become a financial stakeholder in the companies racing to build the machines that could someday break the encryption protecting every bank account, every military communication, and every piece of critical infrastructure on the planet. The reaction was immediate, and it wasn't confined to press releases. Within minutes of the news breaking, quantum computing stocks on Wall Street began to move in ways that looked less like a market reacting to policy and more like a market reacting to a declaration of intent. IBM, already a towering name in the space, jumped roughly 6% in pre-market trading. That was the modest move. Infleqtion, a smaller and less familiar name to most investors, soared more than 20% before the opening bell even rang. D-Wave Quantum climbed 16%. Rigetti Computing rose nearly 14%. GlobalFoundries, the chipmaker set to receive hundreds of millions under the package, jumped close to 15%. And in the days that followed, as the details solidified and the deals moved toward completion, some of those gains compounded further. Rigetti eventually surging more than 60% over a matter of days, D-Wave climbing more than 50%. This is the part of the story most headlines stopped at. The stock surge, the dollar figures, the excitement of a sector suddenly thrust into the center of Washington's industrial strategy. But the real story, the one that explains why this single funding announcement carried so much weight, sits underneath the numbers. It's a story about who actually gets the money, what they're building, and why the United States government suddenly decided that quantum computing was too important to leave entirely to the private sector. Start with where the money is going, because the distribution tells you almost everything about the strategy behind it. Of the $2 billion, the single largest beneficiary is IBM, set to receive about $1 billion, half the entire package directed at one company. But IBM isn't simply pocketing a check. The company is matching that government investment dollar for dollar, committing an additional $1 billion of its own capital, and the combined $2 billion is earmarked for something very specific: the construction of America's first purpose-built quantum chip foundry, a facility being built in Albany, New York, and given the name Anderon. Why does a dedicated foundry matter so much that it justifies this kind of spending? Because quantum chips are not like the silicon chips that power your laptop or your phone. They require radically different fabrication processes, different materials, different tolerances for error, and different equipment entirely. For years, quantum companies have been forced to borrow time and space on fabrication lines designed for conventional computing, retrofitting processes that were never built for the extreme precision quantum hardware demands. A dedicated foundry changes that equation completely. It means a facility engineered from the ground up to produce the wafers that become the beating heart of a quantum processor, at a scale and a consistency that borrowed fab space simply cannot deliver. IBM's own leadership has framed this as more than just an expansion. It's described as the foundation the entire domestic quantum supply chain has been missing. Beyond IBM, the remaining $1 billion is spread across 8 more companies. The list reads like a snapshot of the American quantum ecosystem's competing bets on how to actually build a working quantum computer. GlobalFoundries is in line for roughly $375 million, tying the semiconductor giant more directly into quantum-specific manufacturing. D-Wave Quantum, Rigetti Computing, and Infleqtion are each expected to receive around $100 million. A smaller Australian startup, Diraq, is set to receive about $38 million. Rounding out the list are Atom Computing, PsiQuantum, and Quantinuum, each pursuing a different technical approach to the same ultimate goal. That diversity of approaches is not an accident, and it's worth pausing on because it says something important about how the United States government is actually thinking about this race. Quantum computing isn't a single technology with one clear winning design, the way, say, smartphone processors converged around a handful of dominant architectures. There are multiple competing physical methods for building a quantum computer, and nobody, not IBM, not Google, not China's top research institutions, knows for certain which one will ultimately scale into a stable, fault-tolerant machine capable of outperforming classical supercomputers on real-world problems. Superconducting qubits, the approach used by IBM, Rigetti, and China's own Origin Quantum and Quantum C-Tech, rely on circuits cooled to temperatures colder than deep space. Trapped ion approaches, used by companies like Quantinuum, manipulate individual charged atoms with lasers. Neutral atom approaches, the path Infleqtion and atom computing are pursuing, use arrays of individual atoms held in place by finely tuned light. Photonic approaches, PsiQuantum's specialty, encode information in particles of light itself. By spreading its $2 billion across nearly every one of these competing technical bets, the US government isn't picking a single winner. It's hedging, deliberately and openly, against the very real possibility that today's leading approach won't be tomorrow's practical one. A senior Commerce Department official even acknowledged as much publicly, noting that many of these investments could take years to bear fruit, and that the diversified structure was intentional, a hedge against the uncertainty of which underlying technology will ultimately prevail. That's not the language of a government chasing a quick political win. That's the language of a government trying to insure itself against getting the biggest technological bet of the century catastrophically wrong. Think about how unusual that posture actually is for Washington. Federal research funding has historically flowed through peer-reviewed grants, national laboratories, and university programs, distributed on timelines measured in academic years rather than market cycles. This is something different. This is the federal government behaving less like a research sponsor and more like a venture investor with national security as its return on investment, willing to place multiple simultaneous bets on companies that, in some cases, have never turned a profit and may not for years. That's a meaningful shift in how Washington thinks about technological competition, and it carries real political risk. If any of these 9 companies stumble, fail to deliver, or simply lose the technical race to an approach nobody funded, critics will have an easy target. Taxpayer money spent propping up speculative technology companies with uncertain paths to commercial viability. And there's another detail buried in the funding structure that deserves attention because it marks a real departure from how Washington has traditionally handled industrial policy. In exchange for these grants, the federal government isn't just handing out money and walking away. It's taking minority equity stakes in every single one of the 9 companies. That means American taxpayers, through their government, now hold an actual ownership position in the outcome of the quantum race. This isn't the first time the current administration has structured a deal this way. Similar equity arrangements have already been used in other sectors viewed as strategically vital, including a stake of nearly 10% in Intel, and partial ownership positions in rare earth materials, companies like MP Materials and Vulcan Elements. Quantum computing has now joined that list of technologies the US government considers too important to fund from a distance. That framing, technology too important to fund from a distance, brings us to the actual reason this story is being told as a confrontation with China, rather than simply a domestic funding announcement. Because underneath all of this sits a much older, much more consequential fear. The fear of what happens the day someone builds a quantum computer powerful enough to break the encryption the entire modern world runs on. Inside the industry, that hypothetical day has a name. They call it Qday. It refers to the moment a quantum computer becomes capable of cracking the cryptographic systems, things like RSA encryption, that currently protect everything from bank transfers and medical records to classified government communications and military command systems. Nobody knows exactly when Qday will arrive, or even if the current generation of quantum hardware is on a path that leads there at all. But the stakes attached to that uncertainty are enormous because, unlike most technological races, this one carries a first-mover advantage that could be irreversible. Whoever gets there first doesn't just gain a temporary edge. They potentially gain the ability to read anything encrypted with today's standards, including data that adversaries have been quietly collecting and storing for years, waiting for the day the encryption protecting it finally breaks. That's precisely the scenario keeping American national security officials awake at night, and it's precisely the scenario China's own quantum strategy has been built around exploiting. For nearly 2 decades now, Beijing has treated quantum technology not as a research curiosity, but as a national megaproject, on par with its most ambitious strategic undertakings. The results of that sustained, centralized investment are visible and, in several respects, genuinely ahead of where the United States stands today. China built and launched Micius, the world's first quantum satellite, years before Western space agencies had even secured funding for a comparable project. It constructed the Beijing-Shanghai quantum communication backbone, a dedicated fiber optic network stretching over 1,000 miles, designed specifically for quantum secure communication. It developed the Jiuzhang and Zuchongzhi quantum computers, machines that Chinese researchers have used to claim demonstrations of so-called quantum advantage on specific, narrow computational tasks. By most independent assessments, China holds a clear and largely uncontested lead in one specific corner of this race: quantum communications and quantum networking. China currently owns the only two quantum satellites in existence anywhere in the world. According to analysts who track the sector closely, Beijing has deployed quantum networking infrastructure at a scale no other country has attempted, even if that infrastructure remains, in the words of one European researcher, still largely experimental, built and operational, but not yet carrying the kind of sustained, mission-critical traffic that would prove its real-world value at scale. But quantum communications is only one piece of the larger puzzle, and it's not the piece most directly tied to the fear driving the Qday scenario. That fear centers on quantum computing itself, the raw processing power to actually run the algorithms capable of breaking encryption. And here, the picture looks meaningfully different. Despite China's massive spending advantage, despite the state-directed megaprojects, despite the satellites and the fiber backbone, independent research groups tracking the global quantum landscape consistently find that the United States retains a real, measurable lead in quantum computing specifically. American platforms dominate global quantum software development by a staggering margin. IBM's quantum programming toolkit, Qiskit, has recorded more than 450,000 downloads, compared to roughly 4,000 for China's closest comparable software package. That's not a marginal gap. That's a signal of where the world's quantum researchers, students, and developers are actually building their skills and their careers. And infrastructure gaps like that tend to compound over time, rather than close on their own. The hardware picture tells a similar story. Estimates place the number of quantum computers deployed by American entities somewhere between 39 and 73, compared to an estimated 15 to 18 deployed across all of China. Even accounting for the uncertainty in those figures, and there is real uncertainty since China has strong incentives to obscure the true scale and sophistication of its most advanced military-linked programs, the gap is significant enough that it shapes how most serious analysts describe the state of the race. The consistent conclusion isn't that America is safely ahead across the board. It's that the two countries are ahead in different specific dimensions of an enormously complex technological frontier, and that neither side can currently claim total dominance. That nuance rarely survives contact with a punchy headline, which is part of why claims about the race get so distorted in public conversation. Take, for example, one episode that circulated widely and did real damage to the accuracy of public understanding. A Chinese state media report claiming that researchers had used quantum computing power to break military-grade encryption. The claim spread quickly, exactly the kind of story built for viral alarm, and it fed directly into the broader narrative that China had already achieved a Qday-level breakthrough. It hadn't. The claim was subsequently debunked by independent researchers who examined the underlying technique and found it fell far short of what had been claimed. But debunked claims rarely travel as far as the original alarm, and the damage to public perception lingered long after the correction. Still, even with that specific claim discredited, the underlying concern it tapped into is not imaginary. Multiple voices inside the American defense and technology community have been explicit about how seriously they take China's overall trajectory. Speaking at a technology conference focused on the Indo-Pacific region, one prominent quantum AI researcher put it in blunt terms, arguing that China sits roughly a decade ahead of the United States in quantum computing, specifically because it never diverted a generation of scientific and engineering talent into fighting a prolonged war on terror the way America did. Whether or not you find that specific framing persuasive, the broader point resonates across the field. China built its quantum strategy with a level of continuity and centralized focus that the United States, distracted by other priorities and organized around a far more decentralized research ecosystem, simply didn't match for the better part of 2 decades. That history is essential to understanding why the $2 billion funding package landed with the force that it did. It wasn't just money. It was a signal that the United States government finally intends to compete on China's own terms, matching centralized, strategic, government-directed investment with programs of its own, while still trying to preserve the private sector dynamism that has historically been America's competitive advantage in technology. That's a genuinely difficult balance to strike. Move too slowly, and you risk ceding permanent ground in a race with irreversible stakes. Move too aggressively towards centralized control, and you risk suffocating the exact kind of decentralized innovation, venture capital, competitive startups, open academic collaboration, that has allowed American technology companies to out-innovate state-directed rivals in nearly every other sector for the past half-century. The legislative backdrop adds another layer of urgency to this balancing act. The National Quantum Initiative Act, The primary federal framework coordinating America's quantum research efforts across different agencies is currently scheduled to expire in 2029, and several of its earlier provisions already lapsed back in 2023. Renewing and strengthening that framework has become a growing point of emphasis among policy experts who track the field, some of whom argue the Act needs to be expanded significantly, bringing in additional federal partners like NASA, investing more aggressively in quantum workforce development to train the scientists and engineers this industry desperately needs, and deepening cooperation with allied nations to build a broader coalition capable of matching China's scale. Without that renewal and expansion, experts warn, even a landmark achievement like the $2 billion funding package risks becoming a single dramatic gesture rather than the start of a sustained national strategy. And sustained is really the operative word here, because nearly every serious voice examining this competition arrives at some version of the same conclusion. This race will not be decided by a single announcement, a single satellite launch, or a single funding package, no matter how large or symbolically important. It will be decided by which country can sustain its investment and its focus over a decade-long horizon, translating laboratory breakthroughs into operational at-scale systems that actually function reliably in the real world, year after year, without losing political will or funding momentum along the way. Impressive research results make for compelling headlines, but they don't determine who ultimately wins. Deployed, working systems do. There's also a structural vulnerability sitting underneath this entire competition that rarely makes it into the celebratory coverage of funding announcements, and it's worth naming directly because it complicates any simple story about American advantage. Quantum hardware, like so much of advanced technology manufacturing, depends on a supply chain of critical minerals and specialized components, and a meaningful portion of that supply chain still runs directly or indirectly through China. American researchers typically don't purchase certain essential compounds straight from Chinese suppliers. They buy them through domestic chemical companies instead, but those domestic companies frequently still depend on Chinese-controlled raw materials somewhere further up the chain. China has already demonstrated a willingness to use that leverage strategically, announcing export control restrictions on certain separation technologies and tightening its grip on critical mineral exports in recent years, moves widely interpreted as a signal in anticipation of further American trade restrictions. Even as the United States pours new capital into domestic quantum manufacturing capacity, reshoring the raw material and component supply chains that manufacturing ultimately depends on could realistically take a couple of decades, according to policy researchers who've studied the problem closely. Building a chip foundry in Albany solves part of the puzzle. It doesn't solve all of it. There's a geopolitical irony sitting inside that dependency too, one that rarely gets acknowledged in the celebratory coverage of the funding announcement. The very supply chains America needs to build its quantum future run partly through the country it's racing to outpace. Chinese firms have continued making hardware progress of their own, despite years of American export restrictions, sourcing critical equipment from non-American suppliers when direct American channels were closed off. Footage aired on Chinese state television has shown domestic quantum chip manufacturers using specialized fabrication equipment sourced from European suppliers, a workaround that illustrates just how difficult it is to fully seal off any single country from the global technology supply chain, no matter how aggressive the export control regime becomes. That reality complicates the simple story of American technological containment, and it's a reminder that this competition isn't a closed system with two isolated players. It's a tangled, interdependent global supply chain that both countries are simultaneously racing through and racing to control. It's also worth being honest about how young this entire industry still is, because the funding numbers and the geopolitical framing can make quantum computing sound further along than the underlying business reality actually supports. Revenue figures across the sector remain remarkably small for a technology commanding this much political and financial attention. D-Wave, one of the most established public quantum companies, generated less than $25 million in revenue over the past year. Rigetti's figure was smaller still, at roughly $7 million. Even IonQ, the largest of the publicly traded pure-play quantum companies by revenue and notably absent from the government's funding list, generated only around $130 million. Analysts do project meaningful growth from these figures over the next several years. Some forecasts suggest revenues across leading companies could multiply many times over by the end of the decade, but by the standards of most technology sectors that command this level of national strategic attention, quantum computing today is still overwhelmingly a research and early commercialization industry, not a mature one, generating the kind of returns its stock price movements might suggest. That gap between speculative excitement and current commercial reality is exactly why the stock surges that followed the funding announcement carry a certain amount of built-in volatility and risk. Quantum stocks have proven, again and again, to be exceptionally sensitive to headlines, surging dramatically on a single piece of policy news, then just as easily giving back those gains when sentiment shifts or when a report turns out to be less concrete than initially reported. A single announcement, a single leaked government memo, a single skeptical analyst note can send these stocks swinging by double-digit percentages within hours. That volatility reflects a market still trying to price in a technology whose ultimate timeline and ultimate winners remain genuinely uncertain, even to the experts building it. None of that uncertainty, though, changes the strategic calculation driving Washington's decision to act now rather than wait for more clarity. The logic animating this entire funding package rests on a simple, almost unforgiving premise. In a race where first-mover advantage could be irreversible, waiting for certainty is itself a form of risk. If quantum computing capable of breaking modern encryption arrives, even a few years before the world has fully transitioned to quantum-resistant security standards, the consequences ripple across every sector that depends on digital trust: banking, healthcare, defense, critical infrastructure, and the basic communications infrastructure modern society runs on. That's why federal standards agencies have already begun strongly encouraging organizations across every industry to begin transitioning toward quantum-resistant encryption well before the end of this decade, treating the eventual arrival of a cryptographically relevant quantum computer not as a distant hypothetical, but as an inevitability worth actively preparing for today. So where does that leave the actual state of the race once you strip away the headline-driven framing on both sides? It leaves a genuinely close, genuinely high-stakes competition between two very different national strategies. China's approach is centralized, patient, and willing to absorb enormous inefficiency and failure in pursuit of long-term strategic dominance. A government structure, as one analyst who studies the country closely put it, willing to accept waste as the price of occasionally producing breakthroughs the rest of the world simply cannot match. America's approach has historically been decentralized, driven by private capital, university research, and competitive market pressure. An ecosystem that has repeatedly proven capable of producing breakthroughs no centrally planned system could have anticipated, but one that has also, until this moment, lacked the kind of sustained, coordinated, long-horizon government backing that a race with genuinely civilization-altering stakes may ultimately require. The $2 billion quantum funding package doesn't resolve that tension. It doesn't declare a winner, and by most honest measures, it doesn't even conclusively prove America has closed whatever gap exists in the areas where China still leads, particularly in quantum communications and networking infrastructure. What it does prove is that the United States government has finally, unambiguously decided to stop treating quantum computing as just another item on a long list of emerging technologies worth modest research funding, and started treating it instead as a strategic priority worthy of direct, hands-on financial involvement, complete with equity stakes, dedicated manufacturing infrastructure, and a diversified bet spread across nearly every competing technical approach the field has to offer. That shift in posture is what actually rattled markets and dominated headlines that Thursday morning. Not a single scientific breakthrough, not a secret weapon unveiled, but the unmistakable signal that Washington now views this race with the same seriousness China has treated it with for the better part of 20 years. Whether that shift arrived in time, whether the money reaches the right companies pursuing the right technical approaches, and whether the political will to sustain this kind of investment survives the inevitable changes in administration and budget priorities over the coming decade, those questions remain genuinely open. But one thing changed unmistakably on that Thursday morning in May. The era of America treating quantum computing as an afterthought in its competition with China is over. What comes next depends on whether this moment becomes the beginning of a sustained national effort, or simply the loudest single chapter in a race that, by nearly every serious account, is still far from decided.